In 1694, a ship called the Ridderschap van Holland vanished somewhere between the Cape of Good Hope and the island of Mauritius. 63 men were on board. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies washed ashore. No message in a bottle. The Dutch East India Company recorded the loss in a single line of bookkeeping, adjusted their quarterly projections, and moved on. Because the Ridderschap was not unusual. She was one of roughly 150 ships that the company lost over the course of its existence. And the thing that should genuinely unsettle you about that number is that most of those ships did not sink in battle or go down in storms. Most of them simply disappeared. One day they were there. The next day, the ocean was empty, and nobody ever found out what happened. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. If you are new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment, because today we are going to talk about the most famous ghost ship in history. But we are not starting with the ghost. We are starting with the ship. Because before the Flying Dutchman became a legend, it was just an ordinary vessel crewed by ordinary men, sailing into conditions that were anything but ordinary. And if you had been one of those men, stepping aboard a Dutch merchant ship in the 1600s, you would not have survived. Over the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why. Let us begin with what you would have smelled. A Dutch East India Company vessel, known by its initials VOC, typically carried between 100 and 200 men packed into a wooden hull roughly 130 feet long. That is shorter than a modern basketball court. Below deck, headroom averaged about 5 feet. Ventilation did not exist as a concept. The bilge, that lowest point of the hull where water, waste, and spilled cargo collected, produced a stench so powerful that the physician Nicolaas de Graaf, who sailed with the company multiple times, described it as enough to make a man lose consciousness. He was not exaggerating. Hydrogen sulfide gas, which smells like rotten eggs, built up in those unventilated spaces and could actually render a person unconscious or worse. Your sleeping arrangements were a narrow space on a wooden platform shared with several other men, their lice, their fleas, and whatever illness they happened to be carrying that week. There were no separate quarters for the sick. If the man next to you developed dysentery, which happened with depressing regularity, your options were to endure the consequences or move to a different spot where someone else might be coughing up something worse. Privacy was a word that had no practical meaning below deck. Personal space was whatever you could defend with your elbows. Now, let us talk about what you were eating. The VOC provisioned its ships with hardtack biscuits, salted beef, salted pork, dried peas, barley, and butter. That sounds almost reasonable until you learn what happened to those supplies after a few weeks at sea. The biscuits developed weevils almost immediately. Sailors learned to eat them in the dark so they would not have to see what was crawling through the bread. The salted meat turned gray and took on a rubbery texture that one sailor compared to old boot leather, which was actually unfair to boot leather. The water, stored in wooden casks, turned green with algae within 3 weeks and developed a smell that competed with the bilge for sheer offensiveness. Sailors strained it through their teeth and tried not to think about what they were swallowing. Butter went rancid. Cheese grew fur. The dried peas turned into something that bore no resemblance to any food you have ever encountered. And this was the good phase of the voyage. If the trip ran long, and trips very often ran long, you moved into the phase where there simply was not enough food left. Rations got cut in half, then cut again. Men began eating rats. They scraped barnacles off the hull and boiled them. They chewed on leather straps. The Portuguese navigator Antonio Galvão recorded sailors on one desperate voyage eating sawdust mixed with the remnants of whatever they could scrape from the bottom of empty barrels. That was dinner. The VOC knew all of this, of course. They ran the numbers. It was cheaper to lose a percentage of the crew to starvation and disease than to provision the ships properly for every possible delay. A dead sailor did not collect wages for the return trip. The company's own records show that between 1580 and 1795, roughly 1 million Europeans sailed to Asia on their ships. About a third of those people never came home. Some died in combat. Some died of tropical diseases on shore. But a staggering number simply died at sea from scurvy, dysentery, typhus, malaria contracted in port, and plain starvation. The ocean was not the adventure. The ocean was the price of admission, and the price was measured in human bodies. But of all the things that killed sailors, one stood above the rest in sheer cruelty: scurvy. If you have heard of it at all, you probably think of it as a mild deficiency. Some bleeding gums, maybe a few loose teeth. That description is like calling a hurricane a light breeze. Scurvy was a horror show. It began subtly enough: fatigue, aching joints, a general feeling that something was wrong but you could not quite name it. Then the gums started to swell. They turned purple, then black, and began to bleed at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds that had healed years ago reopened, as if the body was simply forgetting how to hold itself together, which is essentially what was happening. Vitamin C is necessary for collagen production, and without it, the body's connective tissue literally comes apart. The legs swelled. The skin developed dark, painful bruises from internal bleeding. Breathing became difficult as fluid accumulated in the lungs. Men became too weak to climb the rigging or even stand. In the final stages, the internal bleeding became catastrophic. The disease killed slowly over the course of weeks or months, giving its victims plenty of time to understand exactly what was happening to them. A Dutch physician named Johann Bachstrom estimated that scurvy was responsible for more deaths at sea than all other causes combined, including shipwrecks, storms, and combat. He was probably right. Here is the part that makes scurvy genuinely tragic rather than just terrible. The cure was absurdly simple: fresh fruit, specifically citrus fruit. And people actually knew this in a scattered, unreliable sort of way. In 1593, the English Admiral Sir Richard Hawkins wrote that sour oranges and lemons were the most effective remedy he had seen. The Dutch themselves used lemon juice on certain voyages. But the knowledge never stuck. It kept getting discovered and then forgotten and then discovered again, because the underlying mechanism was invisible and the prevailing medical theory of humors offered a more sophisticated-sounding explanation. It took until 1747 for James Lind to conduct a controlled experiment proving the citrus cure, and even then the Royal Navy did not make lemon juice standard issue until 1795. 200 years of sailors died from a disease that could have been prevented with a glass of orange juice. And what do you think? If you had been on that ship, would you have trusted the doctor or the sailor who said lemons help? Write that in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Now, imagine you have survived the food, the scurvy, the disease, and the stench. You have been at sea for months, and your ship is approaching the single most dangerous navigational point on the entire VOC trade route: the Cape of Good Hope. The name itself is a lie. It was originally called the Cape of Storms by the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias, who was the first European to round it in 1488. The Portuguese king renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because a name that sounds like certain doom is bad for investor confidence. That piece of political rebranding may be the most consequential marketing decision in maritime history. The Cape sits at the collision point of two enormous bodies of water, the warm Agulhas Current flowing south from the Indian Ocean and the cold Benguela Current pushing north from the Antarctic. When these currents meet, particularly when they run against prevailing winds, they produce some of the most extreme wave conditions on the planet. Rogue waves exceeding 30 meters, roughly 100 feet, have been documented in these waters. For a wooden sailing ship with a hull maybe 6 feet above the waterline, that is not a wave. That is a wall of water taller than a 10-story building moving at the speed of a freight train. The VOC lost more ships at the Cape than at any other single point on its routes. And it was here, in these exact waters, that sailors began seeing things. A ship on the horizon moving against the wind, full sails in a dead calm. A vessel that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. They were not imagining it. What they were seeing was a phenomenon called a fata morgana, a type of superior mirage caused by temperature inversion. When a layer of cold air sits beneath a layer of warm air, light bends in unusual ways, projecting images of objects that are actually far beyond the horizon. A real ship, dozens of miles away and well below the line of sight, can appear to float above the water, inverted, distorted, and seemingly defying physics. In the waters around the Cape, where warm and cold currents create exactly these atmospheric conditions, fata morganas are not rare. They are routine. But 17th century sailors did not have the physics to explain what they were seeing. What they had was exhaustion, malnutrition, grief for dead crewmates, and a deep religious conviction that the ocean was a place where God and the devil fought for human souls. When a ship that should not exist appears on your horizon and then vanishes like smoke, you do not reach for atmospheric optics. You reach for the only explanation your world offers you: a curse. And that is where a captain named Vanderdecken enters the story. Or rather, that is where someone invented him. Because here is what most people get wrong about the Flying Dutchman. There was no original Captain Vanderdecken. He did not exist as a historical person. The legend assembled itself from pieces, like a ship built from the wreckage of a dozen other ships. And tracing those pieces is more interesting than the ghost story itself. The earliest known reference to the legend in print comes from a travel memoir published in 1795 by a man named George Barrington. In it, a character describes a tradition among sailors about a Dutch ship lost near the Cape of Good Hope, condemned to sail those waters forever. There is no captain's name, no murder, no curse, just a lost ship that keeps appearing. That is the seed. The soil it grew in was 2 centuries of real maritime catastrophe. The VOC alone lost over 150 ships. The Portuguese, Spanish, and English lost hundreds more. Every port city in Europe had families who waited for ships that never returned. The legend was not invented by one person. It was exhaled by an entire civilization that had sent its sons into the ocean and gotten silence in return. In 1821, a magazine called Blackwood's Edinburgh printed a short piece that added the critical ingredient: a captain who swore a blasphemous oath. In this version, the captain of a Dutch vessel, fighting a terrible storm near the Cape, refused to seek shelter, and swore he would round the Cape if it took him until Judgment Day. The Almighty, apparently, took him at his word. The ship was condemned to sail forever, never reaching port, and any vessel that spotted it would suffer misfortune. Now the legend had teeth. It had a moral structure: pride and defiance of God, followed by eternal punishment. That framework mapped perfectly onto the Protestant theology that dominated Northern Europe, and it spread like fire through every port from Amsterdam to London. Then in 1839, Captain Frederick Marryat published a novel called The Phantom Ship. This is where the name Vanderdecken first appears. Marryat gave the captain a son who spends the entire novel searching the seas for his cursed father, trying to redeem him. The book was a bestseller. It was translated across Europe, and suddenly the Flying Dutchman was not just a sailor's rumor anymore. It was a named character with a backstory, a motivation, and a face. Marryat did not discover the legend. He manufactured the version that everyone remembers. 4 years later, in 1843, a 29-year-old German composer named Richard Wagner premiered an opera called Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman. Wagner's version added the final piece: redemption through love. His Dutchman can only be freed from his curse if a woman loves him faithfully unto death. The opera was a sensation. It cemented the legend into high culture, gave it emotional weight, and guaranteed that the story would survive long after the Age of Sail ended. Every version of the Flying Dutchman you have ever encountered, in film, in television, in video games, traces its DNA back to Wagner's opera house in Dresden. But here is the twist that makes the real history stranger than any fiction. 40 years after Wagner's opera, the legend received what appeared to be official confirmation. On July 11, 1881, the Royal Navy vessel HMS Bacchante was sailing off the coast of Australia. On board were 2 British princes, George, who would later become King George V, and his brother, Albert Victor. At 4 in the morning, a midshipman on watch reported a strange light. 13 crew members, including both princes, came on deck and observed what the ship's log describes as a phantom vessel glowing with a red light. The entry was made in the official record. A Royal Naval vessel carrying the future King of England formally documented a sighting of a ghost ship. The following day, the sailor who had first reported the sighting fell from the rigging and was gone. Coincidence, of course. But try telling that to a superstitious crew in 1881. What do you think actually happened that night off Australia? A fata morgana? Mass suggestion? Something else entirely? I would love to hear your theory in the comments. The Flying Dutchman never stopped sailing. Long after wooden ships gave way to steam and steel, the ghost kept showing up in the most unexpected places. In 1939, dozens of people on a beach in South Africa reportedly watched an old sailing ship bearing down on the rocks at full speed before it vanished into a bank of fog that appeared from nowhere on a clear day. A Cape Town newspaper ran the story. Nobody could explain it. Nobody particularly tried. During the Second World War, crews of German submarines operating in the South Atlantic reported seeing phantom sailing vessels on several occasions. Admiral Karl Donitz allegedly mentioned it in private conversation, though he never put it on the official record. Whether these sightings were mirages, hallucinations brought on by the extreme stress of submarine warfare, or something else, they demonstrate that the legend had outlived the age that created it. The Flying Dutchman did not need wooden ships or trade winds to survive. It only needed the ocean and human beings willing to stare into it long enough. But the real afterlife of the legend happened not at sea, but on stage and screen. Wagner's opera never stopped being performed. It runs in opera houses from Vienna to New York to Tokyo every single season. The story was adapted into films as early as 1903, when a British silent film attempted to capture the ghost ship on celluloid. The 1951 British film Doomed Vessel retold the story with a romantic angle lifted directly from Wagner. And then, in 2006, the Flying Dutchman sailed into the biggest movie franchise on the planet. Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, introduced Davy Jones and his ship, the Flying Dutchman, to a global audience of hundreds of millions. The film took enormous creative liberties, barnacles growing on the crew, a captain with an octopus for a face, a ship that could travel underwater. But the core remained Wagner's framework: a cursed captain, an endless voyage, and redemption through love. The screenwriters knew their source material. They just covered it in tentacles. What is remarkable is how little the emotional core of the story has changed across 3 centuries. A ship that cannot stop, a captain who cannot die, a crew that cannot go home. Whether you are a Dutch sailor in 1690 hearing the story whispered in a tavern in Batavia, or a teenager in 2024 watching it on a screen, the fear is the same. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of being trapped, of moving endlessly without arriving, of being forgotten by the world while remaining conscious of what you have lost. The VOC went bankrupt in 1799. The Dutch maritime empire collapsed. The trade routes that once carried nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon at the cost of tens of thousands of lives fell quiet. The wooden ships rotted. The sailors' names were forgotten. But the ghost ship they invented from their suffering and their fear and their desperate need to explain why the ocean kept swallowing people whole, that ship is still out there. It sails through Wagner's music. It sails through Hollywood blockbusters. It sails through every story anyone has ever told about the price of pushing too far into a world that was never designed to welcome human beings. And the darkest detail of all? The legend says that seeing the Flying Dutchman means disaster is coming. But for the sailors who created that legend, disaster was not coming. Disaster was already there. It was in the food that gave them scurvy, in the water that gave them dysentery, in the captain who could beat them without consequence, and the company that calculated their deaths as acceptable overhead. The ghost ship was never the threat. The ghost ship was the mirror. If you made it this far, you already know this channel does not tell fairy tales. We dig into the real dirt behind the legends. So if you want more like this, subscribe to Dead Man's Shore. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story hit you the hardest, and I will see you in the next one. Fair winds, and watch your horizon.